Born as Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, Catherine the Great rose to prominence following her husband Peter III's overthrow in a coup, eventually becoming Empress of Russia in 1762. Her reign, one of the longest in Russian history, was characterized by a major restructuring of the Russian legal and administrative systems, as well as large-scale territorial expansion. Enlightenment principles were also adopted by Catherine, who in fact communicated with many of the great thinkers of her day, including Voltaire, and promoted education, the arts, and the sciences. Russia became more powerful and centralized under her leadership, annexing more territory in parts of Poland and even Alaska, as well as expanding its empire to encompass Crimea. But her domestic programs, like as the Charter to the Nobility and attempts to codify laws, greatly improved Russia's government. In spite of her progressive changes, Catherine's reign was marked by tighter restrictions on the serfdom and severe suppression of uprisings like the Pugachev Rebellion, which ultimately contributed to civil unrest. But the legacy of Catherine is indeed a complicated synthesis of authoritarian rule and progressive thought that ultimately helped Russia become one of Europe's superpowers. Welcome to the channel, everyone. Hello to the newcomers, and it's good to see those returning once again. As always, supporting the channel is easy. Just enjoy it. And if you want to just move that mouse up to the like and subscribe button, that will tell YouTube to tell other people to enjoy it. And other than that, well, why don't we just get started? Deep breaths, and let's get nice and relaxed. It's going to be a very, very long one, a video that's been requested for quite some time. So let's get into it. In the province of Pomerania, the Kingdom of Prussia, on May 2nd, 1729, Catherine Sophia Augusta Friederike von Anhalt-Zerbst Dornberg was born. And don't worry, for both of our sanity, we won't be using her full name after this, but it's important that we mention it. Now, Joanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp was her mother. Her father, Prince Christian Auguste of Anhalt-Zerbst, was a member of the Anhalt reigning German dynasty. In his function as governor of the city of Stettin, he had the status of a Prussian general at the time of his daughter's birth. But he also failed to become the Duke of the Duchy in Courland and Semigalia. Nevertheless, her mother's brother ascended to the Swedish throne, and two of her first cousins, Gustav I and Charles XIII, became kings of Sweden as a result of her second cousin Peter III's conversion to Orthodox Christianity. That is the same Christianity that the Russians remain, for the most part. Well, she was mostly tutored by a French governess, and acquired her education from her parents as was customary for Germany's royal families. And apparently she had become such a proficient swordswoman. She was also seen as quite a tomboy, according to her memoirs. And in general, it was not really a particularly interesting childhood for her. Well, despite being born a princess, her family was not wealthy. Instead, her mother Joanna's rich relatives, who were also related to the royal family, supported her ascent to prominence. A highly competitive political structure resulted from the more than 300 sovereign states that made up the Holy Roman Empire, many of which, by the way, were small and quite weak. The different princely families battled for advantages over each other, and frequently in diplomatic ways, political marriages, things like this. Well, one of the finest ways for tiny German royal families to further their interests was through such an opportune marriage. So, through her early years, Catherine, or Sophie as she is referred to in those times, was prepared to marry a strong leader in order to elevate her family's status. Now, apart from her native German, she was also acquiring fluency in French, which was the common language among the European aristocracy during the 18th century, of course supplanted by English later. Well, the young Catherine was schooled according to the norm for a German princess in this time, with a focus on French, Lutheran theology, and of course, good manners, because that's how you win the best husband, right? Well, when Catherine was 10 years old in 1739, she made the acquaintance of her future spouse, Peter III of Russia, who was actually her second cousin. Far be it for me to judge other people's lifestyle choices. Well, later in her writing, she had said that she found Peter to be actually quite repugnant from the very beginning, and that she stayed at one end of the castle, while Peter stayed at the opposite. Among the things that she did not like about him was his reportedly fair skin, too pale and sickly looking. But the main problem was his alcoholism. Certainly breaking stereotypes, Peter III, isn't he? Well, it leads us to talk about the Lopukina scandal, in which Count Jean Armand de Lestoc and King Frederick the Great of Prussia participated actively, and it had an impact on Sophie's selection as the Tsar's future wife. Remember, I'm sometimes going to use those names interchangeable, Sophie and Catherine, so do not get confused. It's just an earlier name to refer to her. Now, the goals of this scandal were to topple the Chancellor, Alexei Bestezev-Lyumin, who was recognized as a supporter of the Austrian alliance and whom the Russian Empress Elizabeth was depending on, and to fortify the friendship between Prussia and Russia while decreasing the power of Austria. The participation of Joanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, Sophie's mother, had a major role in the diplomatic intrigue's failure, and it did fail. Now, Joanna is portrayed in historical records as a cold and violent queen who enjoyed court intrigues and was constantly gossiping and causing trouble. Joanna's desire for fame was fueled by her daughter's potential to become the Empress of Russia, but she also enraged Elizabeth, who eventually forbade her from entering the nation on grounds that she was reportedly spying for King Frederick, which is a very easy accusation to make but very difficult to prove. So Elizabeth was well acquainted with the family and had planned to wed Charles Augustus, who was the brother of Joanna. Well, prior to the wedding in 1727, he passed away. Smallpox. Bad luck. Pretty common way to go back then. Well, Elizabeth developed a deep affection for Sophie, in spite of Joanna's meddling, and Sophie and Peter were eventually married in 1745. Took a while to get there, but yeah, eventually they got there. Now, at the age of 15, she traveled to Russia. This was 1744, and she made absolutely every effort she could to gain the favor of Elizabeth and her husband, Alexei Razumovsky, and the Russian people as a whole, trying to win the hearts and minds. Well, she even studied the Russian language, staying up late in her bedroom to review her lessons. She contracted pneumonia, however, as a result of staying up so late in the bitter Russian winter, but she did make a full recovery. She actually said in her memoirs that at the time she decided to believe whatever was required of her in order to be eligible to hold the throne, and to take whatever necessary action. Well, despite her ability to pick up Russian, she did have quite a strong accent, and she made certain grammatical mistakes when she spoke, frequently misspelling her words in her writing. But if you've ever studied Russian, and you know about Russian grammar, well, you really need to give her a break about that. Russian grammar is a nightmare. It's up there with Polish and Czech. It's not very fun. Well, in her court, however, she spoke French most of the time. Now, actually, the Russian imperial court used French as its primary language until 1812, when the conflict with Napoleonic France made speaking French at court politically unacceptable for obvious reasons. Now, in her memoirs, Catherine recalled that she contracted a pleuritis immediately upon arriving in Russia. This was this pneumonia she had from studying too much, and it nearly killed her. But she attributed this survival to a very traditional treatment. Frequent bloodlettings, which are also called phlebotomies. She reportedly had 4 of them in one day. It's enough to make anybody dizzy. I don't know about you, but I'm not good with people taking blood from me. And I can think about it back then, how unpleasant that situation would be. Well, her mother's resistance to this custom earned her the wrath of the Empress. You see, Catherine's mother had her confess to a Lutheran priest when it appeared that her position was dire, yet 1 foot out the door. But when she awoke from this trance, she declared, "I want my Orthodox priest, not any Lutherans." That's one way to rebel against Mum, isn't it? The wrong kind of Christian, apparently. Well, she gained more favor with the Empress and her court as a whole as a result of this, so it may have been a PR move, but either way it worked. You can't argue with her. After that ordeal, Elizabeth loved Sophie, or Catherine, and thought of her basically like a daughter. Now, the devoted German Lutheran father of Sophie was against his daughter's conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy, for obvious reasons. Of course, you want to believe so hard in the religion, you don't want your daughter converting and becoming a heretic, right? Because we all know what happens to them, living or dead. Well, on June the 28th, 1744, she was admitted as a member of the Russian Orthodox Church, in spite of her parents' protests. and at this point she finally adopted the new name, Catherine, making her, in all aspects, the namesake of Catherine I, Elizabeth's mother and Peter III's grandmother. New name, new life, new me. When a long-awaited dynastic marriage between Catherine and Peter ultimately took place in St. Petersburg the next year, on the 21st of August 1745, Catherine was 16 years old at the time. And guess what? Her father did not show up to the wedding. Takes a lot for a dad not to show up to his daughter's own wedding, especially when she's about to become the Empress of Russia. He must have been very, very disappointed in her conversion. Now, the groom, who was then known as Peter von Holstein-Gottorp, had been made the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp in 1739. Now, what exactly is Holstein-Gottorp? Well, it's a region in northwest Germany. It's kind of close to the border of Denmark. Of course, back then there was such fragmentation with these little regions. The Holy Roman Empire is a very, very complicated place. Well, was a very complicated place. Now, the young court lived in this palace of Oranienbaum for many years after the newlyweds moved in, and from there they oversaw the duchy in order to get experience in ruling Russia. The duchy covered less than a third of the present German state of Schleswig-Holstein, including the portion of Schleswig which is occupied by Denmark. Now, aside from that experience, the marriage did not work out, reportedly because of Peter III's mental immaturity. It was not consummated for years. Well, following Peter's affair, Catherine started seeing other notable members of the court, and she quickly gained popularity among a number of influential political factions hostile to her husband. Catherine, who was, of course, quite unhappy with her situation, started reading a lot of novels to deal with it, mostly in French. Her husband, however, had a little bit of more of a boring obsession with reading Lutheran prayer books, and also history and trial notes of highway robbers who had been hanged or broken upon the wheel. Everybody sort of thought he was a little bit weird for that. Now, she read Voltaire and other French Enlightenment philosophies for the first time during this period. Her interest in the literature of her chosen nation grew as she studied Russian too. Tacitus was the first intellectual she read who grasped power politics as they are, not as they should be, and it was his annals that in the end produced what she called a revolution in her young mind, and I don't blame her because Tacitus is fantastic. Now, his claim that people act for reasons other than their stated ideals particularly impacted her, teaching her to look for the hidden and interested motives behind actions. Think about that, huh? Well, Alexander Herzen, who edited a version of Catherine's memoir, states that, contrary to what Catherine later claimed, she had not yet completed her marriage to Peter when she had her first sexual encounter with Sergei Saltkov while residing at Oranienbaum. Now, however, Catherine would later bequeath her son, the future Paul I, the complete version of her memoirs, in which she had given an explanation for why Paul had been Peter's son. Pretty juicy stuff, huh? Well, Catherine intended to become empress herself and did not want another successor to the throne. However, Elizabeth blackmailed Peter and Catherine to create this heir. Saltykov was exploited to make Peter envious. So, both Peter and Catherine had participated in a military conspiracy in Russia in 1749 that sought to install Peter and Catherine as Elizabeth's replacement. Elizabeth probably intended to deny Catherine and Peter any claim to the Russian throne as a result of this conspiracy. Therefore, Elizabeth did not permit Catherine to have sexual relations with anyone until after Paul, the son of Peter and Catherine, had survived and seemed to be in good health. I've had it up to here with your rules. How constrictive. Well, following this, Catherine had numerous extramarital affairs with different men over the years. She made acquaintances with the sister of her husband's official mistress, Princess Ekaterina Vorontsova-Dashkova. Now, for those who lived in the palace, Peter III's temperament became quite intolerable. In fact, male slaves would hear him call out drills in the morning, and then they would join Catherine in her room to sing and dance until the small hours of the day. Anna, Catherine's second child, was born in 1759 and lived for a mere 14 months. Rest in peace, that's horrible, isn't it? Well, Peter was misled into thinking that he was not the child's biological father, due to multiple rumors about Catherine's promiscuity. He is reportedly to have exclaimed to her, "Go to the devil," when Catherine fiercely denied his allegation, which of course back then was a lot more of an offensive thing to say, not something to be blurted out lightly. So, she shielded from Peter's harsh nature by spending most of her time alone in her own boudoir. Catherine made a strong implication in the initial draft of her memoirs, which Hurston edited and published, the aforementioned Alexander Herzen, that Saltykov, not Peter, was her son Paul's biological father. In fact, there's a really interesting line in her memoirs, a quite upbeat one, and she said it prior to taking the throne, about her state of mind then. And this is from her memoirs. "I used to say to myself that happiness and misery depend on ourselves. If you feel unhappy, raise yourself above unhappiness, and so act that your happiness may be independent of all eventualities." That's pretty cool, huh? I like that. Well, following Elizabeth's death on January the 5th, 1672, which in some other time zones was December 25th, 1761, they're using different kinds of calendars, Peter became Emperor Peter III, and Catherine became Empress Consort. The newly constructed Winter Palace in St. Petersburg became home to the imperial couple. The same groups Catherine had fostered as supporters were turned against by the emperor and his policies and peculiarities, particularly in his deep respect for Frederick II of Prussia. You see, Russia and Prussia had engaged in combat in the 7 Years' War. That was between 1756 and 63. Yes, 63. And in 1761, the Russian forces had taken control of Berlin. Well, Frederick II lost most of the nobles' support because of Peter's backing. Frederick proposed splitting up Polish areas with Russia, and Peter put an end to Russian activities against Prussia. In addition to that, Peter mediated a disagreement concerning Schleswig province between the Duchy of Holstein and Denmark. He also organized a war against Denmark, Russia's longtime ally against Sweden, while serving as the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp. Well, just 6 months after ascending the throne, in July 1762, Peter stayed at Oranienbaum with his relatives and courtiers who were born in Holstein, while Catherine resided in a neighboring palace. Catherine received the news that one of her co-conspirators had been taken into custody by her estranged husband on the evening of July the 8th, 1762, and that the coup they had been preparing would have to happen immediately. So she left the palace, and the following day headed to the Izmailovsky regiment, where she gave a speech pleading with the soldiers to keep her safe from her husband. Following that, Catherine headed to the Semenovsky barracks with the Izmailovsky regiment, where the clergy was waiting to anoint her as the only heir to the Russian throne. So, as Catherine II, she commenced her rule as the Empress of Russia. Certainly off to a rough start, though. Oof. Well, she left no one to contest her rule after having her husband jailed and coerced into signing an abdication paper. 6 months after taking the throne, on July 17th, 1762, Peter III passed away in Ropsha, possibly at the hands of Alexei Orlov, the younger brother of Gregory Orlov, who was the court favorite and took part in the coup. This occurred 8 days after the coup that shocked the outside world, and it's said that Peter was assassinated, but we don't really know how he passed away. They did do an autopsy, though, and following the procedure, apoplexy, stroke, and a severe episode of a hemorrhoidal colic were determined to be the official causes. But, you know, who's writing the report? Well, we don't want to put our tinfoil hats on. Now, other possible contenders for the throne at the time, and there were a few of them, included Ivan VI, who was believed to be mad after being imprisoned at Schlüsselburg on Lake Ladoga since he was 6 months old, and I don't blame him for going mad with that. In fact, he only lived to about 24 years old. Not a very good life. Well, as part of a botched coup against Catherine, Ivan VI was slain while being attempted to set free. So too bad for him. Similar to Elizabeth before her, Catherine had issued explicit directives specifying that if Ivan was to be tried again, he was to be murdered. No more messing around. Another possible opponent was the woman who would subsequently be known as Princess Tarakanova, circa 1745 to 1775. Now, despite not being a member of the Romanov family, the ruling dynasty in Russia, Catherine's forebears were from the Rurik dynasty, which ruled Russia before the Romanovs did. While following the legal precedent set by Empress Catherine I, who had succeeded her husband Peter I in 1725, she succeeded her husband now as Empress Regent. But historians argue over whether Catherine was a legitimate usurper or a regent, and that the distinction was only made acceptable by her son, the Grand Duke Paul. Well, on September the 22nd, 1762, she was officially crowned at the Assumption Cathedral in Moscow. With her coronation came the creation of the imperial crown in Russia, which is one of the main treasures of the Romanov dynasty, fashioned by the French-Swiss court diamond jewelers Jeremy Pausier. Now the crown was made of 2 half-spheres, one made of silver, and the other of gold, which stood for the Eastern and Western Roman empires, respectively. They were split by a foliate garland and secured with a low hoop, drawing inspiration from the Byzantine style. Encrusted with 4,936 Indian diamonds and 75 pearls, the crown represents strength and power with its laurel and oak leaves, old symbolism. All Romanov rulers were crowned with the great imperial crown, starting in 1762, and continued until the monarchy was abolished in 1917. It is currently on exhibit in the Moscow Kremlin Armory Museum, and is one of the main artifacts of the Romanov dynasty. Perhaps we can all go and see it, once the situation in the world calms down a little bit. But of course, to me, the real treasure is my dear subscribers. Love you all. Thank you. Now, in the course of her reign, Catherine added roughly 520,000 square kilometers, which is about 200,000 square miles, to the Russian Empire's borders, at the expense of 2 major powers, that being the Ottoman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. She also absorbed New Russia, Crimea, the North Caucasus, Right Bank Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Courland. Now, Catherine's foreign minister, Nikita Panin, had a significant impact right from the very start of her reign. The astute statesman Panin spent millions of rubles and a great deal of time establishing the Northern Accord between Sweden, Prussia, and Russia in order to challenge the influence of the Bourbon-Habsburg League. But Panin lost favor with Catherine when it became clear that the plan was simply just not going to work. And she had Ivan Osterman, who was in office between 1781 to 1797, take over his job. Early retirement. Well, in 1766, Catherine consented to a trade agreement with Great Britain, but refrained from forging a full military alliance. Despite seeing the advantages of friendship, Catherine was cautious about Britain's growing influence after winning the 7 Years' War, which put the balance of power in Europe in quite a bit of jeopardy. Now, during the Azov Wars, Peter the Great established himself in the south near the Black Sea. But after the Russo-Turkish Wars of 1768 to 1774, Catherine completed the conquest of the south, establishing Russia as the most powerful nation in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire suffered some of its worst losses ever at the hands of Russia, notably at the Battle of Kargul, which was on the 21st of July 1770, and the Battle of Chesma, 5th to the 7th of July in the same year. You see, up to 20,000 captives for the Crimean slave trade were taken during the last significant Crimean Nogai slave expedition in 1769, which devastated the Russian-held lands in Ukraine. So, there was certainly a casus belli to get them back for that. And they did. Well, the Russians established the new cities of Odessa, Nikolaev, and Yekaterinoslav, which literally means the glory of Catherine, and also Kherson, in what is now southern Ukraine, thanks to their victories that gave them access to the Black Sea. The Russians were also granted territory at Azov, Kerch, Kinburn, and Yenikale, and the narrow stretch of the Black Sea coast between the rivers Dnieper and Bug by the Treaty of Kuchuk-Karniarka, which was signed on the 21st of July 1774. In addition, the treaty made Crimea a protectorate of Russia, abolished limitations on Russian naval and commercial activities in the Azov Sea, and gave Russia the authority to defend Orthodox Christians across the Ottoman Empire. Of course, they needed all the help they could get. Now, the Russian State Council declared in 1770 that it would support eventual Crimean independence. A Crimean Tatar named Sahin Giray was appointed by Catherine to manage the Crimean state and keep cordial ties with Russia. After numerous attempts to maintain his government with the use of financial assistance and military might, his time in power proved to be unsuccessful. In 1783, Catherine finally annexed Crimea. So the Russians took possession of the Crimean Khanate's palace. A triumphal procession led by Catherine in the Crimea in 1787 served as a catalyst for the outbreak of the Second Russo-Turkish War. In 1787, that same year, the Ottomans and Russians reopened hostilities. Following the Treaty of Jassy in 1792, which gave Russia legal title to the Crimean Peninsula and awarded Russia the Yedesan region. This war was yet another disaster for the Ottoman Empire. Too long didn't read. The Russians mopped the floor with the Ottomans, picked them up by the ankles, and just swished them around in the bucket, and just mopped the floor with them completely. Too bad, so sad for them. Well, the winning streak had to end eventually for the Ottomans. Now, Russia promised to defend Georgia from future invasions and the political ambitions of their Persian suzerains in the Treaty of Georgievsk in 1783. Now, after Persia, under the new monarch Aga Muhammad Khan, had once more invaded Georgia and established authority in 1795, driving out the recently built Russian garrisons in the Caucasus, Catherine launched a fresh campaign against them in 1796. But overthrowing the anti-Russian Shah and installing his pro-Russian half-brother, Morteza Koli Khan, who had deserted to Russia as his successor, was the Russian government's ultimate objective. Now, most people assumed that the experienced general Ivan Gudovich would lead a 13,000-man Russian corps, but the Empress took the advice of her lover, Prince Zubov, and gave the command to his younger brother, Count Valerian Zubov. In April of 1796, Russian troops departed Kizlyar, and on May 21st they overran Derbent, a strategically important citadel. Zubov's army quickly captured the majority of present-day Azerbaijan by mid-June 1796, including its three main cities, Baku, which is the current capital, Shamarka, and Ganja. By November, they were positioned to launch an assault on Iran's mainland, at the meeting point of the Arax and Kura rivers. Paul I gave the order for the army to withdraw into Russia, apparently because he hated the idea that the Zubovs had other plans for the army. While the powerful Zubovs and other commanders involved in the campaign were enraged by this reversal, and became rather annoyed with Paul. Several of them would go on to be among the conspirators who planned Paul's murder 5 years later. Yes, they were that angry. Well, of course, Catherine didn't want to be overshadowed by all this. She yearned to be acknowledged as a wise ruler, not just somebody in the background. So she declined to allow a Russian force to occupy Germany and rejected the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, which contained ports on the Atlantic coast. Rather, she initiated for Russia the function that Britain subsequently performed for the majority of the 19th and early 20th centuries as a global peacemaker in conflicts that might or really did escalate into war. In 1778 to 79, with the War of the Bavarian Succession, she served as a mediator between Austria and Prussia, the two German powers, in order to protect neutral shipping from being searched by the British Royal Navy during the American Revolutionary War. She founded the League of Armed Neutrality in 1780. Now, from 1788 to 1790, Russia waged war on Sweden at the instigation of King Gustav III of Sweden, who was Catherine's cousin, who wanted to attack St. Petersburg directly and anticipated overpowering the Russian army, who was still fighting the Ottomans. However, in the tied Battle of Hoogland, July 1788, Russia's Baltic fleet blocked the Royal Swedish Navy, and the Swedish army was simply unable to advance. In 1788, Denmark and Sweden went to war. That was called the Theatre War, by the way. The two parties signed the Treaty of Varala on August 14, 1790, confirming the Treaty of Abo and returning all acquired lands to their respective owners following the Russian fleet's crushing defeat in the Battle of Svenskund in 1790. Now, Russia was to have no further role in Sweden's domestic affairs after this, and Gustav III received large payments. Well, despite his assassination in 1792, there was peace for 20 years. Of course, he wasn't around to see it. He was too dead. Now, Catherine also restored her ex-lover, Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski, to the Polish crown in 1764. Frederick II of Prussia originated the idea of splitting Poland, but Catherine played a role in putting it into action in the 1790s. Her official designation as the guardian of the political rights of dissidents and peasants in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1768 led to the Confederation of Bar, a Polish rebellion against Russia that was backed by France in the years between 1768 and 1772. Well, following the defeat of the rebels, their French and European volunteers, and the Ottoman Empire, which was their ally, by the way, Catherine instituted in the Commonwealth a form of governance that was entirely under the control of the Russian Empire via permanent council, overseen by her envoys and ambassador. She chose to intervene in Poland, fearing that the May Constitution of 1791 may empower the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that the growing democratic movements there could threaten the European monarchies. She supported the Targowica Confederation, an anti-reform group within Poland, and after victories in the 1792 Polish-Russian War and the 1794 Kosciuszko Uprising, Russia, along with Prussia and Austria, partitioned the remaining Polish territory in 1795. Tensions between Russia and China were high due to the Qianlong Emperor's expansionist policies in Central Asia and his view of Russia as a threat. The Qianlong Emperor, of course, being the one in China in the ruling Qing dynasty at the time. Well, he unilaterally revoked the Treaty of Kyoto, which had governed trade between the two empires, partly due to the influx of Dzungar Mongol refugees into Russia after the Qing Emperor's terrible treatment of them. Either run away or die. Well, in fact, Catherine's disdain for the Qianlong Emperor was evident in 1790 in a letter to Baron de Grimm, where she actually referred to him as, and I quote, "my Chinese neighbor with small eyes." Now that's crossing the line, isn't it? Hashtag cancel Catherine. Well, Russian expansion in the Far East increased interest in trade with Japan. After a Japanese sea captain, Daikokuya Kodayu was shipwrecked in Russian territory in 1783. Catherine met with him in 1791 and subsequently sent a trade delegation to Japan in 1792. Unfortunately, trade negotiations with the Tokugawa shogunate completely failed. They were not very keen on dealing with outsiders. Full video on that soon, well until the Americans showed up and pointed the cannons at them. "Open the gates or we'll kill you all." Now that's diplomacy. Well, Catherine's foreign policy in general, criticized by her grandson Nicholas I as deceptive, was marked by several missteps and a lack of long-term strategy. In fact, she gave away large territories of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a Russian protectorate since the reign of Peter I. Despite initial intentions for an honest foreign strategy, she transformed Russia into a major global power. However, her policies, including international trade in Russian grain and resources, contributed to famines and weakened her dynasty's power in relation to Austria and Germany. Catherine established a thorough framework for governmental control over the operations of merchants too, but it was ineffective because it discouraged and restricted entrepreneurship and did not provide incentives for economic growth. When she actively promoted the migration of the Volga Germans, that is, Volga Germans, not VULGAR Germans. It's the Volga River. Now the German farmers we're referring to who primarily settled around that river valley. So when she actively promoted their migration, she saw much greater success. And they did in fact contribute to the modernization of the industry that dominated Russia's economy. For example, they brought several improvements in the fields of sheep farming, tobacco cultivation, small-scale industry, and of course wheat production and flour milling. Of course, wheat being quite an important crop up there in the northern regions. Well, issuing the first government paper money was tasked to the Assignation Bank in 1768. Now in 1769 it made its debut in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Later a large number of bank branches were opened in what are known as government towns in neighboring districts. Now similar amounts of copper money were required to be paid in order to issue paper notes, which were then presented for a return. Growing pains changing to all this new currency, but, well, it's not easy. Well, due to significant government spending on military requirements, which resulted in a scarcity of silver in the treasury. For example, transactions, particularly in international trade contexts, were conducted pretty much solely in silver and gold coins. Real money, if you know what I mean. Well, the formation of these assignation rubles was essential because of this. So assignment rubles were in circulation at the same rate as the silver ruble, and there was a continuous market exchange rate for these two currencies. And by the way, they were in use, these notes, all the way until 1849, so about 80 or so years. It's not a bad run. Well, Catherine gave her financial reforms a lot of thought, and she mostly relied on Prince A.A. Wyazemski's counsel, who knew a lot more about it than anybody else. She discovered that the lack of a coherent state budget meant that a piecemeal change was going to be completely ineffective. And as for war, well, that requires money, as always. You can't go into a war with empty pockets. And that meant that the outdated banking systems had to be abandoned. Well, the definition of obligations by function was a fundamental tenet. The fundamental law of November the 7th, 1775 established that. After centralizing authority under Wyazemski's Office of State Revenue, the government had its first rough draft of a state budget by the year 1781. And as boring as it all sounds, it's extremely important. Without a proper state budget and a proper economy, things tend to fall apart pretty quickly, especially when you want to go to war, which I have said requires quite a significant amount of money. Well, it's not all the boring stuff. Of course, public health, too, is slightly less dry, and Catherine gave quite a big amount of importance to that, too. You see, she drew on Russian antecedents and experiments, including foundling homes as well as the social theory concepts of French physiocracy, and German cameralism. She established the Moscow Lying-In Hospital and Foundling Home in 1764. She then established Paul's Hospital, often called Pavlovskaya Hospital, in 1763. She ordered the government to compile and release essential data related to public health so things could be optimized further, and demanded that the army improve its medical capabilities in 1762. She also created a centralized medical administration and assigned it the task of enacting strict health regulations. She also made the decision to have English physician Thomas Dimsdale vaccinate her against smallpox. If you know anything about smallpox, it's best if you do everything you can to avoid that. Well, despite the fact that this approach was contentious at the time, she was successful, and later her son Pavel also received an injection. Well, during her reign, serfs were bound to the land that they farmed, belonging to the land-owning nobility. In fact, a census from 1754 to 62 indicates that Catherine possessed 500,000 serfs, and another 2.8 million belonged solely to the government of Russia. Now, serfs, they weren't, we can't really use the term slaves. They were not quite slaves, but they were pretty much slaves. Legally, they could leave, but, well, no one really had the means to do so. Of course, it's different, depending on the different systems between different nations. All in all, they weren't exactly slaves, but they had very few rights. They were born into servitude, raised on the same land as their parents, and lacked legal ownership of property, though some managed to amass enough wealth to buy their freedom. When the law was poorly understood or ignored, particularly in the provinces where most serfs lived, allowing some to navigate the system and accumulate a decent amount of money for themselves. Of course, the serfs surrendered their freedoms for protection and assistance during hard times, becoming the property of landowners, who provided them with land to cultivate in exchange for taxes on a portion of their harvest. Catherine inherited this system, but she did introduce some changes. She allowed serfs to file complaints against nobles through legal channels if they were mistreated, removing herself as the direct point of appeal to avoid potential unrest and personal harassment. Well, this change gave serfs a status as legitimate bureaucrats, enabling a few of them to benefit, such as securing freedom if owned legally. However, a landowner's power over his serfs remained pretty extensive, including the ability to punish them harshly, and even send them to Siberia for hard labor. And, well, Siberian hard labor is very different to anywhere else's hard labor. It is the hardest of labors. Well, the serfs' lives were considered property of the state, and while they historically appealed to the autocrat for help, Catherine discouraged direct communication and even passed laws to prevent it. But despite this, she did make efforts to somewhat improve their conditions, such as limiting the creation of new serfs and the issuing of the 1775 Manifesto, which prevented freed serfs from being re-enslaved, if we can use that term for it. Well, her reign also saw more opportunities for serfs to leave the land, as I've mentioned, such as attending schools or learning trades, especially due to the educational institutions she established. While serfs could sometimes work for pay or be hired out, they were otherwise tied to land, but they could be conscripted into the army, which, well, a rock and a hard place, I'm afraid. Well, traditionally, serfs viewed Catherine positively, but radical or unpopular policies led them to believe that the true ruler had been replaced by a false empress, usurped even. Their words, not mine. Well, they often blamed the nobility, these terrible upper classes, for distorting the empress's intentions, and saw them as corrupt, leading to misunderstandings of her orders. In fact, Catherine faced particular suspicion from the serfs because she reversed a decree by Peter III that had freed the Orthodox Church serfs. Her attempts to limit their ability to petition her further also alienated them, especially given their distance from the capital, and also the limited knowledge of her rise to power. Of course, think about it in those days. I think it was, I know this is kind of around the same time, the first president of the United States. He did not hear about being the first president until some time later, because he lived in the middle of nowhere, and did not get the letter yet. Took a couple of weeks even for him to even know that he had been elected. So, of course, when you have serfs out in the middle of the country, they're not really sure who their ruler is if it changes abruptly. In fact, by the time that Catherine was in, well, there's not much that anybody could really do about it. And realistically, if the serfs disagreed, what are they going to do? Well, numerous additional things contributed to the unhappiness of the peasants, including as crop failure and epidemics, particularly a significant one in 1771. Beginning around 1767, the serfs' freedoms were also more restricted, and their land was being taken away by the aristocrats, who were enforcing a harsher rule than before. Pugachev's rebellion of 1774 saw widespread outbursts of violence and rioting as a result of their unhappy living conditions. One can hardly blame them. And of course, when you've got nothing to lose, you may as well try your luck. Well, because of their distaste for Catherine and her policies that gave the nobles more power, the serfs most likely followed someone who was posing as the real empress, although this was not the first time under Catherine's rule that they had done so. The most orthodox peasants and serfs were swayed to support Pugachev's cause by the stories he told about himself acting like a true emperor and assisting regular people, listening to their problems, praying for them, and overall just being quite saintly, a gentleman and a man of the people. Keeping all of this unhappiness in mind, Catherine did govern for 10 years before the serfs' resentment erupted into an insurrection that matched Pugachev's in size. Well, after the bloody uprising, Catherine was driven away from the goal of serf independence, which is why the insurrection ultimately failed, and, well, even backfired. Well, Catherine was also a supporter of education, literature, and the arts. At first, the Hermitage Museum was just Catherine's personal collection, but today it takes up the entire Winter Palace. It is massive. Well, being an avid art and literature enthusiast, the Empress commissioned the building of the Hermitage in 1770 to store her growing library of books, paintings, and sculptures. In fact, there were 38,000 volumes, 10,000 jewels, and 10,000 pieces of art housed at the Hermitage 20 years later by 1790. And her, as they were called, curiosities, occupied 2 wings, these collections of things from far-flung places in the earth. Of course, at that time, there were so many places still yet to be checked out, at least by Europeans who had not seen them before. Well, in May of 1770, she gave the order to plant the first English landscape garden at Tsarskoye Selo. I quote in a letter that she had wrote to Voltaire in 1772, where she said, "Right now, I adore English gardens, curves, gentle slopes, ponds in the forms of lakes, archipelagos on dry lands, and I have a profound scorn for straight lines, symmetric avenues." In other words, Anglomania is the master of my plantomania. I detest fountains that torment water by forcing it to flow in a direction that is against its natural course. Statues are placed in vestibules, galleries, and other places. Catherine made a point of collecting Chinese art and purchasing porcelain in well-liked styles, joining the widespread European infatuation at the time with all things Chinese. She had constructed the Chinese Palace at the Oranienbaum between 1762 and 66, which was designed in the Chinese architectural and landscape style. Italian architect Antonio Rinaldi, who specialized in Chinese architecture, created the Chinese-style palace. She also commissioned the Scottish architect Charles Cameron to design and construct the Chinese village at Tsarskoye Selo in 1779. After realizing that it would not be feasible to employ a Chinese architect to design the village itself, Catherine was forced to turn to Cameron, who was also an expert in the Eastern style. But she also composed her own comedies, novels, and even memoirs. Quite lucky we have them. And she went out of her way to attract eminent scientists and thinkers to Russia. She collaborated with French encyclopedists Diderot, Voltaire, and d'Alembert, whose works went on to solidify her renown. Leading economists of the day, including Jacques Necker and Arthur Young, joined the Free Economic Society, which was founded in St. Petersburg in 1765 at her recommendation and attracted broad international membership. She also brought experts Anders Johann Lexell from Sweden and Leonhard Euler and Peter Simon Pallas from Berlin to the Russian capital, all the great minds together at last. Well, during the 15 years between her ascension and Voltaire's unfortunate death in 1778, Catherine wrote to him on behalf of her cause. Her achievements were praised by him, and he dubbed her the rather flattering name of the Star of the North, but also the Semiramis of Russia, which is, by the way, a reference to the mythical Queen of Babylon, of which Voltaire had wrote about in a tragedy a few years earlier in 1768. Unfortunately, though, she never had a face-to-face encounter with him, yet she nevertheless deeply lamented his passing. She bought his whole book collection from his heirs for quite a substantial price, and added it to the Russian National Library. And believe me, it was a very big collection. Well, speaking of books, she was, of course, very much into them, and she had 3 main types of books she would read, ones for entertainment, for knowledge, and for philosophical insight. In the first category, the entertainment, she enjoyed all the popular comedies and romances, particularly those by German writers Christoph Friedrich Nicolai and Moritz August von Thurmer, though critics often dismiss these works as inconsequential. The second category included works by Denis Diderot, Jacques Necker, Johann Bernard Basedow, and Comte de Buffon, which she read to expand her knowledge. Well, she was frustrated, actually, by what she saw as the unrealistic ideas of economists like Necker, even noting her displeasure in the margins of his books. That's right, she took little notes as she was reading. Well, she also studied memoirs and writings that expanded her understanding of the world, such as those by Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville on China, François Baron de Thot on the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate, and even Frederick the Great's autobiographies, along with Benjamin Franklin's pamphlets, which was critiquing and criticizing the British Crown, which gave her more than a few insights into the American Revolution. The third category included philosophical works, by Voltaire, of course, but also Nicolas Baudo and Sir William Blackstone, among others. In fact, Catherine's interest in Blackstone's legal writings reflected her philosophical leanings towards enlightened despotism, which is a beautiful term, I love that, which she saw as the ideal form of governance. Say it again, enlightened despotism. An autocracy guided by the rule of law rather than personal whims. Beautiful. Well, shortly after her succession in 1762, she invited Diderot to complete his monumental work, the French Encyclopedia, and she wanted him to do it in Russia, offering protection after learning the French government threatened to halt its publication due to certain passages being conflicting with the church. You don't want to get on the wrong side of them now, don't you? Well, influenced by 4 years of studying the French philosophers, Catherine attempted to incorporate Enlightenment ideas into Russian legislation. In 1766, she convened a Grand Commission in Moscow, assembling 652 representatives from various classes and nationalities to consult on the empire's needs. She openly admitted to borrowing ideas from Western European thinkers, particularly Cesare Beccaria, in drafting her instructions for the guidance of the assembly. However, Catherine's more experienced and cautious advisers hesitated to implement many of these democratic concepts, and as a result, the Commission, despite holding over 200 sessions, ultimately collapsed without moving beyond mere theoretical discussions. Catherine later began issuing codes to address some modernization efforts outlined in her Nakaz work. In 1775, she introduced a statute for the administration of the Russian Empire's provinces, aiming to improve governance by expanding the number of provinces and districts. By the end of her reign, Russia was split into 50 provinces and nearly 500 districts, with a doubled number of government officials and quadrupled local government spending. In 1785, Catherine granted the charter to the nobility, increasing the power of the landed oligarchs and allowing each district's nobility to elect a marshal of the nobility to represent them before the crown. In the same year, she issued the Charter of the Towns, dividing the population into 6 categories in an effort to limit noble power and establish a middle class, which of course is it's a new idea for that period in time. Well, in fact, even in our modern time, the middle class is shrinking. The lower class is growing and the rich are simply getting richer. Well, the pendulum always swings, doesn't it? Well, that wasn't all Catherine did, though. Additionally, she enacted the 1782 Police Ordinance and the 1786 Statute of National Education, along with the 1781 Code of Commercial Navigation and Salt Trade. In 1777, she had expressed to Voltaire that her legal reforms were progressing little by little in a backward Russia. Takes time for things to catch on, I suppose. Well, her reign also saw the importation and study of European classical ideas, laying the groundwork for the Russian Enlightenment. She also became a significant patron of the Russian opera, and in 1790, Alexander Radishev published Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, predicting revolutions in Russia due to the dire conditions of the serfs. Catherine viewed the book as fostering dangerous ideas of the French Revolution and ordered Radishev's exile to Serbia, and all of the copies of the book burned. Well, at her Tsarskoye Selo home in St. Petersburg, she also welcomed Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who painted her not long before she passed away. Beautiful painting, too. Well, in her memoirs, Madame Vigée-Lebrun gives a detailed account of the Empress, and it goes like this. The sight of this famous woman so impressed me that I found it impossible to think of anything. I could only stare at her. Firstly, I was very surprised at her small stature. I had imagined her to be very tall, as great as her fame. She was also quite fat, but her face was still beautiful, and she wore her white hair up, framing it perfectly. Her genius seemed to rest on her forehead, which was both high and wide, her eyes soft and sensitive, her nose quite Greek, her color high and her features expressive. She addressed me immediately in a voice full of sweetness, if a little throaty. She said, "I am delighted to welcome you here, madame. Your reputation runs before you. I am very fond of the arts, especially painting. I am no connoisseur, but I am a great lover of art." Madame Vigée-Lebrun goes on to depict the Empress during a lavish event. The double doors opened and the Empress appeared. I have said that she was quite small, and yet on the days when she made her public appearances, with her head held high, her eagle-like stare, and a countenance accustomed to command, all this gave her such an air of majesty that, to me, she might have been queen of the world. She wore the sashes of 3 orders, and her costume was both simple and regal. It consisted of a muslin tunic embroidered with a gold fastened by a diamond belt, and the full sleeves were folded back in the Asiatic style. Over this tunic she wore a red velvet dolman with very short sleeves. The bonnet, which held her white hair, was not decorated with ribbons, but with the most beautiful diamonds. Moscow State Academy of Choreography, also referred to as the Bolshoi Ballet Academy, was established on December the 23rd, 1773, during Catherine's reign, and it became the second school of ballet within Russia. Of course, we've all heard of it. It's probably the most famous ballet school in the world. Well, that is from somebody who doesn't know anything about ballet. I'm just assuming, since that's the ballet school that everybody has heard of. Now, it signed a deal with Filippo Beccari, an Italian teacher and choreographer who was required to be the most capable of dancing, so that the students could learn to dance with all possible precision and to show themselves publicly in all pantomime ballets. In fact, Catherine was deeply devoted to the ideas and cultures of Western Europe, and she desired to surround herself in Russia with these like-minded individuals. She felt that exposing Russian students to European education could produce a new kind of person. Catherine thought that education might lift the Russian people out of their backwardness and transform their hearts and minds. This entailed giving people knowledge and skills, encouraging a feeling of civic responsibility, and developing their moral and intellectual faculties. Modernizing education across Russia in general was one of her main goals. She appointed Ivan Betskoy as her advisor on educational matters, relying on him to gather data from both Russian and foreign educational institutions. She also formed a commission with the historian G. Müller, Teplov von Klingstedt, and F. G. Dilthey, and sought guidance from British pedagogues like Dr. John Brown and the Reverend Daniel Dumaresque. She invited Dumaresque to Russia in 1764, and later appointed him to the Education Commission, which proposed a comprehensive education system for all Russian Orthodox subjects, except, of course, for the serfs. Pretty much anyone aged 5 to 18, as long as you weren't a serf. However, the legislative commission's convening delayed any action on these recommendations. In a letter to Dr. John Brown on July of 1765, Dumaresque discussed the commission's challenges. Brown responded with broad suggestions, emphasizing state-controlled education governed by an educational code, especially for women. 2 years earlier, Catherine had tasked Betskoy with drafting the general program for the education of young people of both sexes, aimed at creating a new kind of citizen in Russia, insulated from the old ways. Well, the Moscow Foundling Home, also known as the Moscow Orphanage, was the first attempt to realize this vision, taking in abandoned and illegitimate children to educate them according to the new state ideals. However, the project largely failed. Why? Well, mainly because everybody was dying, preventing many children from getting to that maturity and intellectual development that the state intended. Well, shortly after the founding of the Moscow Foundling Home, Catherine, guided by Ivan Betskoy, created a manual for early childhood education, based on the theories of John Locke. In 1764, she established the Smolny Institute, Russia's first institution for young girls, initially accepting only noble daughters, but later expanding to include girls from the petit bourgeois. The Smolny Institute emphasized strict discipline, where students, known as smolyanki, learned music, dance, French, and of course how to be unwaveringly loyal to the monarchy, though they were often criticized for being disconnected from the outside world. Physical activities like running were generally discouraged, and the facility was kept cold, reflecting the belief that excessive warmth and play were harmful to developing bodies. I don't know where they got that idea from, but, well, of all places where you would want a facility kept cold, Russia is not the place. Maybe they're used to it. I don't know. Well, between 1768 and 1774, progress on a national education system stalled somewhat, but Catherine continued to explore the foreign educational theories, leading to reforms like the 1766 revision of the Cadet Corps. The Corps began accepting younger children and expanding its curriculum to include sciences, philosophy, ethics, history, international law, and a few more minor fields. Well, following the war and the defeat of Pugachev, Catherine assigned the establishment of schools in gubernias to the boards of social welfare, which included elected delegates from the free estates. By 1782, Catherine had created a second advisory panel to review global education systems, with Franz Aepinus's Austrian-inspired three-tier model gaining particular attention. She appointed Peter Zawodowski to lead the Commission of National Schools, tasked with developing a nationwide school network, teacher training programs, and textbook distribution. This effort culminated in the Russian Statute of National Education, which was enacted on August 5, 1786, establishing a free co-educational network of primary and high schools in the gubernia capitals, accessible to all free classes. While the statute detailed subjects and teaching methods for each group, the teachers received a guide to teachers alongside the textbooks, covering instructional strategies, teacher conduct, and school administration. Subsequent 19th century historians were typically critical despite these efforts. Some had said that Catherine didn't provide enough funding to sustain all of these techniques that were used in her new educational program. However, by the time Catherine's rule came to an end, 549 state institutions were home to an estimated 62,000 students, and that's certainly something. Even though it was a huge improvement, the number was insignificant in comparison to the actual size of the Russian population. It's also possible that Catherine's seeming devotion to all things Russian, especially Orthodoxy, contributed to her own lack of interest in religion. She forced the majority of the surviving clergymen to survive as farmers, or from fees for baptisms and other services, nationalized all of the church lands to help pay for her wars, and essentially cleared out the monasteries. The church, which had previously been, well, the most important thing, became even less so, when very few nobles actually bothered to enter it. After the French Revolution began, she crushed any religious opposition, and dissenters were forbidden from erecting their own chapels. As part of her anti-Ottoman agenda, Catherine supported Christians living under Turkish rule, and sought to assert her influence over Catholics, particularly after the partition of Poland. Through the ukaz of February 23rd of 1769, she restricted the rights of Polish Catholics, limiting papal control over Catholic parishes to theological matters, while allowing them to maintain their buildings and worship practices. She appointed a Catholic bishop of Moliev, later elevated to archbishop, to oversee all Catholic churches under her jurisdiction. Despite the suppression of the Jesuits across much of Europe in 1773, Catherine provided them refuge in Russia, enabling them to finally reorganize. But her approach to Islam was markedly more conciliatory, integrating Muslim regions into her empire through persuasion and financial incentives rather than all-out force. After public unrest, she opted to incorporate Islam within the state, leading to the 1773 Toleration of All Faiths Edict, which allowed Muslims to build their mosques and practice their customs, including the pilgrimage to Mecca, which was previously banned. She also established the Orenburg Muslim Special Spiritual Assembly to regulate the teachings and morals of mullahs, with the assembly's members appointed and funded by the state. In 1785, Catherine financed the construction of new mosques in Muslim communities, aiming to anchor nomadic populations in southern Russia. She also integrated Islamic schools into the Russian public education system in 1786, furthering her efforts to control and settle these populations. Her policies towards Judaism were distinct. Before 1772, Judaism was nearly extinct in Russia, but the first partition of Poland brought a significant Jewish population under her rule. Catherine confined Jews to the Pale of Settlement, imposed double taxes on them, and incentivized conversion to Orthodoxy by waiving these taxes for converts. Converted Jews could obtain permission to become merchants or work as free peasants, reflecting the government's desire to integrate them into Russian society, albeit under quite strict conditions. Thus she incorporated the Jews into the privileges and rules of the Charter of the Towns in 1782 in an effort to integrate them into the Russian economy. For economic reasons, at least primarily, Orthodox Russians were against the introductions of Judaism. Even in the name of equality, Catherine attempted to keep Jews out of specific economic sectors, and in 1790 she forbade Jewish residents of Moscow from belonging to the middle class. Jews were formally recognized as foreigners in 1785 by Catherine, who also granted them some rights. As a result, Judaism in Russia was able to preserve its unique identity during the Jewish Haskalah. Additionally, Jews were denied the rights of naturalized Russian citizens or Orthodox citizens by Catherine's proclamation. Later on, in 1794, taxes on those of Jewish heritage were quadrupled once more, and Catherine formally stated that Jews had no connection to Russians. Not really making them feel very welcome, isn't she? Well, during her reign, the Orthodox Church faced challenges similar to its foreign rivals. Continuing the policies of Peter III, she placed the finances of bishoprics and monasteries under government control, confiscating church lands and replacing their revenue with government endowments that were often less than promised. In fact, of the 954 monasteries, only 164 of them received funding, and she closed 569 of them. The church's treasury was calculated then with just 400,000 rubles, and the Orthodox clergy was excluded from the legislative commission, unlike other religions, including Islam. Catherine imposed strict limitations on the clergy's role in administration. In 1762, she signed a law allowing old believers to freely practice their faith, aiming to reconcile them with the Orthodox Church. Despite her professed religious tolerance, however, she sent nearly 20,000 of these old believers to Siberia in 1764 due to their refusal to comply with her policies. Later, after the Urban Charter of 1785, she allowed old believers to run for municipal office and guaranteed religious freedom for immigrants to Russia. Well, on to something a little bit more scandalous. She also had numerous lovers during her reign, and often giving them significant posts and rewarding them with estates and serfs when their relationships ended. The state's budget, in fact, allocated increasing funds to the court, and she distributed vast numbers of serfs during her rule. Even after her relationships ended, she remained generous to her former lovers, as was seen with Peter Zawodowski, who received 50,000 rubles, a generous pension, and 4,000 peasants. Her final partner, Platon Zubov, was actually 40 years her junior, and, of course, myths about her sexual independence also flourished. Now, Catherine kept her illegitimate son with Gregory Orlov away from the court, raising him near Tula. His son was named Alexis Bobrinsky. Western European elites, of course, were less accepting of a female ruler, as reflected in the British ambassador James Harris's critical report, which praised her strength of mind, but criticized her for qualities that he deemed typically feminine, such as vanity and propensity for flattery. Catherine's connection with Stanislav Poniatowski, a member of the pro-Russian faction in Poland, began in 1755, long before she met the Orlov brothers. His Scottish and Polish lineage tied him to Catherine, and their relationship produced a daughter, Anna Petrovna, officially recognized as Grand Duke Peter's child. After Poland's king Augustus III passed away in 1763, a new monarch had to be chosen. Catherine, of course, backed Poniatowski in his bid to succeed him as king. To stave off any conflicts, she dispatched the Russian troops into Poland. On August 26, 1764, Russia invaded, and they established Poniatowski as king, threatening to start a war over it. Poniatowski, of course, submitted to Catherine's authority by taking the throne, all part of the deal. Well, as word of Catherine's scheme spread, Frederick II, others though claim the Ottoman Sultan did this, forewarned her that all of Europe would turn against her if she attempted to subjugate Poland through her marriage to Poniatowski. Having by then given birth to both the Grand Duke Paul and Orlov's child, she simply had no intention of marrying him. Well, Poland's partitioning were initiated by Prussia, Russia, and Austria under Maria Theresa. During the initial partition in 1772, a total of 52,000 square kilometers were divided among the three powers. Russia acquired lands east of the line roughly joining Riga, Polotsk, and Mohilev. They also gained the largest territory in the second partition, which took place in 1793. It stretched from the west of Minsk nearly to Kiev and down the Dnieper River, with the exception of a few areas of steppe in front of Ochakov on the Black Sea in the south. Subsequent Polish uprisings resulted in the Third Division of 1795. In fact, Poland did not cease to exist as a sovereign state until it was rebuilt after the First World War. But of course the Kingdom of Poland goes back a very, very long time. Quite complicated. Now, the descendant of a rebel who participated in the Streltsky insurrection of 1698 against Peter the Great, Grigory Orlov distinguished himself by sustaining 3 wounds on August 25, 1758, during the Battle of Zorndorf. Catherine objected with Peter's pro-Russian stance, which he described as the reverse. He and Catherine had of course fallen in love by 1759, but nobody told Peter, of course, Catherine's husband. Catherine favored staying the Dowager Empress of Russia to getting married, even though she thought that Orlov would be highly helpful and that he would play a pretty key role in the coup d'etat against her husband, going back to June 28, 1762. But they weren't left out in the cold. Orlov and his 3 other brothers received titles, cash, decorative swords, and all manner of other presents. But Grigory, who was unreliable as an advisor, and frankly incompetent in politics, missed out on his chance with Catherine. When Catherine was made empress, however, he was given a mansion in St. Petersburg, so it wasn't all too bad. Thus, throughout her life, Catherine experienced numerous personal triumphs, but she also faced 2 main setbacks. When King Gustav IV Adolf, her Swedish cousin, once removed, paid her a visit in September of 1796, the Empress's goal was for her granddaughter Alexandra to marry into the Swedish royal family. The engagement was scheduled to be publicized on September the 11th, but instead there was a ball at the imperial court. Well, despite being quite happy for Alexandra, Gustav Adolf felt compelled to acknowledge that she would not become a Lutheran. As a result, he declined to attend the ball and departed for Stockholm. Catherine's health was impacted by her frustration. After recovering sufficiently, she started organizing a ceremony to name her favorite grandson Alexander as her heir, replacing her challenging son Paul. I like the wording, challenging. Well, however, she passed away just 2 months after the engagement ball, preventing the announcement from ever being made. November the 16th, 1796, Catherine got up early, had her morning coffee, and quickly started working on all of her tasks for the day. She then informed Maria Perekosikna, her lady's maid, that she had slept better than she had in quite a long time. She was unfortunately discovered on the ground sometime after 9 o'clock, her face purple, a weak pulse, and her respiration labored and faint. She went into a coma, despite efforts to resuscitate her after the court physician diagnosed her with a stroke. She received the final rites before passing away roughly at 9:45 p.m. the next evening. The cause of death was determined by an autopsy to be a stroke. Of course, there were various rumors circulating about how and why she died. Among these legends, the most well-known is that she passed away following a sexual encounter with her horse. Citation needed on that one. I don't know who was spreading that rumor. Well, at the time of her passing, sarcastic British and French magazines were part of the people who were taking this by the horns and spreading it around. Of course, it's all politics. Very easy to engage in character assassination after people's deaths. The German scholar Adam Oleriaris said that the Russians had a penchant for this activity with horses in his 1647 work, Description of the Muscovite and Persian Journey. In fact, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, anti-Russian literature frequently used this to highlight how supposedly Asian and savage Russia was. What a horrible thing to do. What an insult. Especially right after Catherine's passed away. It's just not cricket, isn't it? Well, after she passed away, her secretary found her will among her files in early 1792, which was undated. But it did have precise directions, stating, "Lay out my corpse, dressed in white, with a golden crown on my head, and inscribe on it my Christian name. My mourning gown should only be worn for 6 months at most. The shorter, the better." Ultimately, the Empress wore a silver brocade dress and was buried with a gold crown. The casket, created and decorated by Antonio Rinaldi, was beautifully embellished with gold fabric and set atop an elevated platform at the Grand Gallery's Chamber of Mourning on November 25th. And there you have it. That's where Catherine's story ends. Of course, the legacy continues, and let's make that a respectful legacy. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons. That's Britt, Charles, Stark Factory, Kimberly, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Aaron, Scott, Kerry, Dark, Ben, and Melissa. Thank you all so much. Appreciate you all dearly. Long videos, huh? You know, usually I don't make them this long. But, there was just so much information on Catherine the Great, and I know that people have been asking me to do a video about her. So why not? Put the time in, really do a deep dive. She's interesting. Anyway, good night everyone, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Lots of love to you all.